Good evening, everybody. Today's session, we're going to be talking about universities in the advancement of African society. This is the second part in the delivery of the three-part series. Thank you very much for attending. We're going to start our session now. I hand you over to Professor Mandi Rukuni. Thank you very much.
Thank you, moderator. And thank you all for coming. So today I'm really going to talk about the transitioning role of universities from their traditional way of looking at teaching, research, community service, and all that, and see where it's all coming from. And I don't see the slides yet. Are the slides coming through, or shall I open up my own slides?
No, they're coming through. It's just a small delay. I think it's like a 4-second delay.
4-second delay. So last week I spoke about where the African university came from in terms of the historical development of universities. So basically for Africa, the first wave was with those Islamic, I should say Arabic Islamic influence coming in from the North and West Africa, ending up with Timbuktu as our first major African university, where there was the fusion between Arabic Islamic religion and culture and African culture, one of the most renowned universities. Meanwhile, in the medieval period, universities were growing. In Europe, largely, the contest was between a religion and state power. Religion was a well-accepted source of knowledge and the final word on what was knowledge, and the state was also gaining power, and the two forces would always fight. So a university in medieval Europe was a compromise between allowing research to happen in universities whilst the state controlled more and more the power to decide. So you'll see that even up to today, the European university would still have your kings and queens as their basic chancellors of those universities, whilst most of the rituals of universities is based from religion, actually. So you would then say, after the medieval period and Europe became industrialized, that's how Europe then began transporting its model of university outside the US. And you'll see that by the time you get to the United States and Japan in particular, the university had evolved from that kind of state religion institution out there for philosophers and thinkers to a developmental university. And you can see how in the United States and Japan, the university quickly became a key vehicle in the development of the nation, with those two countries eventually becoming the most powerful in the world, in terms of both technology and wealth. So when we come to colonization, I would say most of the European countries who colonized Africa did not necessarily build universities, but a few did. The ones that expected a longer stay in countries such as Uganda, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and so on, model of the university. And it was until the Second World War, when now most African countries were fighting for independence, that we began to see now that each country that became independent, if it did not have a university, it had to have one, because it was seen as a developmental institution. So that's what brought us to the conversation last week, to say how after the first 4 or 5 decades, the university did not quite play that role, although it did really produce a lot of technically sound people. But the university being a central in the first 4 or 5 decades, because after the first decade of euphoria after independence, universities became a bit distant. They were mostly in opposition to ruling parties because of the disillusionment that was happening. It is only now that we're in the fourth phase of so-called evolution towards our renaissance that we begin. The university in Africa is now coming back to where it is supposed to be. And that is what I'm going to spend more time talking about today. But for the university to play that critical role, universities have to go beyond just being focused on the technical issues right across the board, but to dig deeper into understanding how societies actually transform. Particularly given that we were left with the colonial model, we are trying to imitate the transformation that Europe went through from being rural agrarian societies to urban industrial societies. And most of our universities in Africa, if not all, they have not mastered the art and the science of how societies transform. And as a result, we haven't really figured out the most important thing, which we need to figure out universities into developmental universities. Because the Eurocentric idea of development still dominates. And yet we know that quite a few regions, if you look at the Asian tigers, they have moved from that colonial model into a much more Asian version of how structural transformation did not quite happen the same way as it did in Europe and then Australia, Canada, and US, but rather starting with Japan, how they had to figure out how to recreate a new form of structural transformation. And now Africa, we're in the third wave. None of the 55 nations in Africa really income trap because of the highly dualistic. Next slide, please. So maybe I open. So I'm going to throw some further insights into how to reinvent the African Developmental University. As I said, the whole of Europe, then the Eurocentric world that came after Europe, that is US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all those followed an orthodox structural transformation where agriculture goes into a production revolution and as a result sponsors an industrial revolution because raw materials, et cetera, move into the urban areas, but demand for industrial goods grows in rural areas and urban areas, and urban areas grow because of manufacturing. That's the orthodox form of structural transformation. But in Africa today, all the 55 countries are either in a low income trap or middle income trap, because that relationship between the rural and urban never existed. It was always a colonial model where a few factories are built in the urban areas and a few farmers in the rural area are connected to the manufacturing sector. That's what leads to a very small domestic market, a dual economy. And as a result, you end up in a middle income trap, which means low economic growth rates, high unemployment rates, growing inequality. And as a result, inequality is a technical thing. It leads into political and social problems, but as a technical issue, the more divergent or the more unequal people are in society, the more difficult it is to come up with public policies that address real issues. So at the end of the day, we are trying to solve the middle income trap in Africa by following very basic instructions from the IMF, World Banks, and the African Development Banks, and all these bankers, call them. They're not serious economists because they don't understand that improving the management of these economies will just manage the symptoms. It does not address the structural problems. These are not temporary problems. They're not self-correcting due to good management. They require major change in the way the economy is structured. And this is what our universities, right across the board from the arts and sciences, need to understand. So moderator, you can always forward the slides before I get to the end, so I see there's a delay. So here's a summary of how society transforms, and this should form the basis of maybe 50% of what we teach across the universities, because an agricultural transformation has to lead to a rural transformation. And a rural transformation means that the agricultural and non-agricultural activities in the rural areas are now causing an industrial revolution. And as that process is taking place, the most important thing to remember is that institutions of any society, be they legal institutions, educational, political institutions, etc., all key institutions of society don't just change overnight because you've got factories built somewhere. These are institutions that transform over time as a result of the industrialization of society. So this is the point I'm going to repeat today until you are all bored ad nauseum, because you have to grasp this point. It's not factories and industries that industrialize a nation. It's the entire mentality of a whole nation. It's the entire pervasion of the idea of what we produce, how we produce it, what we consume, how we consume it, how we relate work at home and away from home, and what happens in the entire society is the industrialization process. So you can see here at the bottom of this diagram, the structural transformation process. The green shows you how the rural sector continues to dwindle over the decades as society industrializes. And at the bottom, you can see the red there, or brown. The industrial sector starts small and continues to grow. When by the time you get to the end here on your right, maybe 98% of the population of a country is now in urban industrial sector. So if you go to all these highly industrialized nations, it's 4%, 3% only people left in rural areas. And that movement of people, families, communities from rural to urban is what transforms the institutions. It's not just because you want to call yourself industrial. When you still have 50% of your people as rural, these institutions won't change as quickly, because it's not about how many factories you build. It's about how the traditional systems adjust to people moving from rural to urban areas in ways that actually require changes. It's all right, you can move to the next one. Yeah, that transformation. So as I say, once people understand that it is society that transforms, not buildings and factories and supermarkets, then we are on to an understanding in universities that I'll come to research later on what we need to focus on. So, as I said, when society transforms from agrarian societies to urban industrial, all economic institutions transform, families, institutions transform, social organization transforms, laws change, the educational system changes from a mentoring at home and community to an industrial model. We go to classrooms and so on and so forth. So by just sending the whole of our population of young people to classrooms does not make us an industrial society, because we are preparing them to a society that does not exist. Then we get surprised when they cannot function in society after they finish education. Religion changes from your primary traditional institutions where everybody belongs to a clan, they know their God from within, to an industrial mode of religion, Islam and Christianity and all these ways, just a mass thing, and it's more doctrine driven. The political systems move from participatory processes at home, in the village, in the community, where everybody participates in the political process, and it becomes also industrialized. So you have two political parties competing, and it's a numbers game. So all institutions transform for a reason. When you just adopt them and don't research and understand how we have them, then we understand, or we begin to understand, why Africa is in the situation it is in today. So the university, if it's going to be a developmental university, has to teach all students, staff, African worldviews and philosophies, how our cultural and social traditions create the different social systems, like our legal traditions. Don't just teach law, teach the actual cultural tradition, which creates the legal tradition, which then creates the legal systems. So as an example, because law and legal systems are one of the single most important institutions that transforms as society transforms. But when we have this kind of dualistic, unorthodox form of dual economy, it becomes difficult to normalize and harmonize what African traditions and European traditions. So we go back into history. We don't go back into history to change history. We don't go back into history because things were better for us. We go back into history to reconnect with what is important for us to move forward. I always give this diagram to show how Africa, for more than 200,000 years after we transformed into Homo sapiens from Homo erectus and others, 200,000 years we did not move out of the continent. Then started moving out, going through into what is today Middle East, some going north. Everyone in Europe today was not there more than 40,000 years ago. They all evolved over the last 40,000 years. And you go all the way to Asia, you can see the evolution and how it took place. And those who crossed from Asia through the Barren Straits to North America, it's only 15,000 years ago. And I don't know, I think by the time you get to South America, it's probably only 10,000 years ago. So this is how we populated Africa very, very few years ago, and how we should therefore not be too surprised how people who only crossed from Africa 40,000 years ago into Europe and became barbarians and so on, and were in the very dark ages. And the moment they industrialize, they can basically attack the rest of the world, because what universities have to understand is that technologies don't always have positive incomes. So as soon as a society has greater capacity to mete out violence, like Europe had over the last 500 years or so, they can go and overrun advanced civilizations, like in South America, you have the Aztecs and others, very advanced in Africa, but because they had bigger guns, they shoot them down. And the moment you have violent power over another person, then your culture is asserted and it's assumed that you are the better one. This is what has happened with colonization. And I need to make this point. I'm making it for the first time since I started talking about this topic, but I'll say it so that I can remind myself to always talk about it. The way Africans civilized themselves before colonization is only one of millions of different ways civilization would have occurred. Same with Europeans. The way Europeans civilized themselves and ended up with agricultural and industrial revolutions is only one of millions of possibilities. So even today, as we speak, every people in the world have capacity to evolve a civilization which is far more advanced and very different from what we're seeing today. So the idea that one form of civilization is what the rest of the world should copy is why we have these problems. Look at how long it took to come up with an alternative form of even developing the same model that the Europeans and the Americans have done. Look at China. China is now the largest economy. It's got to be the most advanced, but completely different models of political organization and developing of a people. So that's what why I always put this slide here. Next, please. So last week I also spoke therefore about how since independence around 1956, 57, we can just say 1960, how it has actually put us in a new position. I talked about how the future of Africa as we come out of the first 5-6 decades of independence really is going to be a great one, especially if universities do play their role. So I'm not going to spend time on this slide. I spoke a little bit about it last time, and it will be available for you to study again. I can always talk about it. But I spoke about the phases and said, in the first decade or so of independence in every country, there's euphoria. Then we go into disillusionment. It takes long to come out of disillusionment because you're so disappointed with your own people in the leadership. Then we go into realism, realizing, wow, this is well beyond individuals and incompetence. It is about structural problems with society. Then that realism begins to, this is where universities begin to play a more meaningful role, because we then eventually talk to ourselves as Africans. We begin to see the rudiments. Starting around 2000, we began to see Africans now converging their political systems, more peace in the world. It may not feel like we have made advancements, but we have made huge strides since 2000 or so. We are beginning to see the rudiments of the Renaissance. And I'm predicting that by 2040, the giant will have actually awoken. And when the giant awakens, one thing happens immediately. All Africans in diaspora will respond. By that time, we won't have the difficulty we have now in a united Africa failing to tell a small country like France or whatever to stop harassing Africans. You know, but once the giant reawakens, we'll just tell the rest of the world, you don't touch an African, you'll have touched all of us. You won't do business on this continent. And we will stop this mass exploitation of the continent. So I'm sorry I had to take a bit of time to remind you what I spoke about last week and connecting it with what I think is the future of the university. But I take the Zimbabwe policy as an example and then but take it beyond the text and say a global interrogation of Education 5.0, what would it mean for an African developmental university? And Education 5.0 comes from the idea that originally the university is concerned with three things: teaching, research, and community service. Now we add innovation and industrialization. So today I'm going to speak about each of these five, but spend more time on innovation and industrialization for obvious reasons, because these are the add-ons. On teaching, we have already spent last few weeks talking about curriculum and teaching. At university level, I'm just going to say this one thing. Universities have to distinguish three levels of applying existing knowledge to transformation. That's what teaching is. Teaching is about getting students and staff to learn based on existing knowledge. So level one is really mastering existing own knowledge that we have ourselves generated from our own society, you see, not starting with other people's knowledge like we are doing now. Mastering existing knowledge generated from our own society, African worldviews, traditions across the board, from basic arts and sciences to engineering and social organization. Level two now then becomes intelligent borrowing from others. You see, because once you believe in your own knowledge system, once you're anchored in your own knowledge system, you can borrow more intelligently. You are less likely to just borrow a copy and paste. Then the third level is learning how to address changes in our society when circumstances change or when knowledge changes, and we require new thinking and new behaving and new mindsets, what I would call a paradigm shift. This is what teaching in every field should concentrate on. I won't say anymore. On research, I want to also say that the repertoire of research in our universities is very, very narrow. Okay, we are doing the most important research at this point in time. In the short term, we are concentrating on short-term issues, problem-solving type of research. But if we are going to be the advanced society that we want to be, I slice research into 5 areas, starting with basic research, or what you might call pure research or fundamental research. The idea here is that if we take any discipline in the university, for argument's sake, let's take physics, and say, how did Europe, since the times of Socrates all the way up to the times of Newton, and then later on all the other geniuses, all the way up to Steve Hawkins and these guys, if you look at it, you will realize that through basic or fundamental research, trying to understand and slice knowledge, deeper and deeper. And in the case of physics, only to find that 100 years of relying on Newtonian physics and looking at the physical world as if it was a solid piece of thing, only to find out later that Einstein and others are now discovering that no, actually everything is just relative. Actually, there's nothing solid. Now we are into quantum physics, which is really mind-boggling. Now, if we're able to understand just within physics that the depth of knowledge is endless, why should we be stuck into political and social organizational theories which may have worked in Europe but are hardly working in Africa? Why can't we do deep research into the family system in Africa, the village system, the community system? Why don't we do deep research into religion? Why don't we do deep research into how we invented everything that was engineering oriented in Africa before we adopted European forms of engineering? I mean, we built amazing structures. We even went beyond and we were able to relate quantum physics to natural physics, stuff like that. So fundamental research, basic research is still necessary in our universities. Then strategic research then becomes, now we understand better the structure of knowledge and existence. Then strategic research then becomes possible for us to see how we can focus on issues that cut across our societies in Africa and issues that touch different aspects of life in society, because strategic research is expected to, for instance, even in the area of food and food systems, it's not good enough to simply say we have to do research in cereals and then meats. We need to be able to say within cereals, although we are reliant on 4 or 5 different cereals from sorghum, millets, wheat, what are issues we need to address across everything that once we figure out is going to improve the entire system? That's strategic research. Then disciplinary research becomes richer because now we can focus on specific subject matters, specific methodologies in specific disciplines, and be able to advance both content and procedures. Then after that, we can become more applied. That's why subject matter research, adaptive research, problem-solving research now become more meaningful. As I say, right now, most universities, we are mainly focused on subject matter and applied researches for obvious reasons, but we desperately need to go back and do more basic research, strategic research, and disciplinary research. Then going on to community service. The changing nature, actually, okay, I've got one more slide on the science because I needed to talk a bit about the philosophy of science and improving capacity of our students and staff to use logic in the processes of discovery. Because we need to teach students right from year one. We don't need to wait until their masters and PhDs for them to understand philosophy of science, how to really do deep deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, ability to dialogue, rational disputation within one discipline and across disciplines. And they have debates which go really philosophic into the processes of reasoning. And I've listed some of the instruments which cut across all types of research, because once again, we're not doing enough of this kind of descriptive research because we're told it's not real science. Well, if you can't describe systems and issues, or if you can't give a historical analysis and you just jump into a problem, if you only concentrate on quantitative aspects of issues, you are not able to qualitatively deeply analyze something. And then you are told by others, oh, qualitative research is kind of biased. It's kind of, and I'm saying, no, but qualitative research can be very objective if you are using the right methods, explanatory analysis and so on. All this needs to be taught to our students from year one in university, and not wait until they are into the research degree. Thanks very much. So that the intellectual properties that we get from there are more than just publications. There's overemphasis on publications in universities. I know, I know during my younger days in the university, that's what drove me. I needed to publish and publish and publish so that I can be an associate professor, then full professor. Fine, but real inventions, patents, copyrights, trademarks, even in universities, depending on how this work is carried out in a manner that is intellectually and academically sound, should all count. Okay, maybe now I've covered the research part. I'm rushing through it, I know, but let me go to community service. Because faculty and students, graduates, should actually provide their expertise to the community all the time. And you have all levels of leadership in our community. Doesn't matter where we are, whether we are in the kind of deep rural or in the small towns, provincial capitals. We have a duty to help counsel these leaders. And when we receive queries from the community leaders, let's actually take these to our students and staff, give some of them as assignments for research, so that when we feed back to our community leaders, it's well considered, it's rich. We need to take research results to the public in a much more exciting and much more relevant ways, and do more volunteering of our student staff, sit on local boards and so on. So that takes care of the traditional role of universities. Now I'm gonna dig deep into these new elements that have been brought in, especially in the Zimbabwe policy in terms of innovation and industrialization. You see, for universities, innovation has to be emphasized both through collaborative efforts as well as individual efforts. So universities should not just push for innovation, they should actually craft strategies and processes that promote successful innovation, and sustainable for that matter, and capacity to innovate. So collaborative arrangements amongst partners need to be revamped in most of the universities as I see it. The roles of key actors in an innovation process need to emphasize the soft skills. At the moment, there's too much emphasis on the harder skills, technology and so on. But the softer skills actually of deeply understanding what works in society and being able to figure out the social innovations is just as important, or maybe even more important in some instances. That's why I'll say that innovation is a systemic process. It's a systematic and yet systemic process. It has to be embedded. It has to be in the DNA of the university as capacity. Capacity to generate and acquire and apply knowledge across social and economic purposes. So research, I know, is a key part of it, but it's not all of it. So research into frontier technologies is important as long as it eventually leads to market and socially driven outcomes. So I would like to also point out that inventions and scientific discoveries are not necessarily innovations. People think that because I've invented something brilliant, therefore it's an innovation. I've really fantastic scientific study with very interesting discoveries therefore it's innovation. No, it's not. There's a distinction between an invention, and an invention is such a solution to a problem, and research could be part of it. But innovation goes beyond, and that very invention only becomes an innovation when it becomes socially and economically successful. Then it's an innovation. There's no other definition of innovation as far as I'm concerned. Don't put a technical definition of it. Just look at, has an invention become socially and economically successful? Then it's an innovation. That's a simplified way of pushing the idea of what universities should be researching on and focusing on. Success can only be declared when inventions are being disseminated, adopted, and used. So this is the first major point I want to make. It requires soft skills. You have to work in multiple boxes simultaneously, and you have to be thinking out of the box most of the time. So I've researched into what would be some useful definitions of an innovation system within a university. And I've come up with 3 elements that would be important to be able to define an innovation system. First, organizations and individuals who are involved in generating and diffusing and adapting and using new knowledge have to be distinctly visible. Then secondly, the interactive processes of learning that are now occur between the organizations and individuals also have to be explicit between these individuals and organizations if these processes are going to produce anything. And then finally, the institutional rules, the norms and conventions, both formal and informal, that govern how these interactions and processes take place are extremely important. So an innovation system can be constructed at any level and using any combination of individuals and organization and national, sectoral, commodity focus, technology intervention focus. It can be at any level and any construct. So innovation can ultimately be defined as a collaborative arrangement that brings together several organizations or individuals working towards different aspects of innovation, pulling together technological, managerial, organizational, and institutional elements into an innovation process. So that's what I would emphasize for universities. So if innovation is going to be a culture in the university has to be able to provide this kind of an environment for students and staff, and not assume that it's going to happen automatically just because people are brilliant. No. So it can be any combination of these entities put up here. I won't bore you with this. You will have a copy of the PowerPoint. And these actors, when they meet, they need a platform that allows them to meet regularly so that they can resolve policy issues and so on. Platforms, systems that help to continuously work vertically and horizontally to integrate different types of knowledge along issues or commodity value chains or sectors and so on. It is important to create these platforms in each and every university. Don't just say, oh, we have a innovation hub, we have we have a factory here for garments and PPEs. A platform is a cultural process where different players, scientists bring ideas focused on the social problems you're trying to solve so that they can discuss ideas, listen to each other, think together, and collaboratively promote innovation. Finally, I'll talk about industrialization. I've already hammered this point, hopefully home, that transformation is about society. Industrialization is a collective behavior of a whole nation. It's not building factories. Industrialization is a process that a whole nation, from village to townships, to small towns, to big town, that a mentality which says, we are now going to mass produce and mass process and mass consume goods and services in different ways. There's no one in today's Africa who should just say we are producing something, whether it's a primary production of a grain or whatever. You should already know why you're producing it, for what, to be processed into what. If you're producing maize, don't just say it's going to produce, it's going to be to eat and different types of, no, we have to already teach our farmers. They have to know that when they produce their sorghum or maize, it's going to go into 5, 6 different industrial products, which make sense to that society. This is what I mean by industrialization in society, not just building factories. Already, we should be telling people in rural areas, they're already in industrial process, even at the lowest level. Don't use these ridiculous terms that the World Bank and others still use, informal sector. There's nothing informal about anything people are doing in Africa. The majority of people are into proto-industrialization and indigenous commerce. Somebody calls it informal sector. 80% of the food eaten in Africa is produced by small farmers. 80%, maybe more. You call it informal. What's so informal about it? It's early stages of the industrial process. It's proto-industrialization to the extent that you can manufacture basic goods without a factory. The fact that one is producing something without a factory does not make it informal. It's a first stage of industrialization. So if you go back to Timbuktu and other civilizations, great civilizations that existed before colonization, we had all the pre-industrial processes: livestock rearing, food production and processing, construction, health and medicine, road construction. Well, it was all happening at that level. And what I'm emphasizing here for universities in Africa is to say, don't then say that was informal. Say, how would we have progressed from those pre-industrial artisanal processes to slowly transform society into a broad-based industrial society, which continues to mass produce its own food and mass process it and mass consume it? This is important for universities to understand why we have to destroy the colonial idea that a dual economy of a few farms producing everything that a few factories are going to process, and you call that an industrial economy, does not work. If you exclude a majority of people in the industrialization process, you have a dual economy, a small domestic market for the produces that you're trying to produce. You're not going to go any place. So a modern African university is to focus on this position that says we have indigenous commerce and indigenous forms of industrialization, which have to be upgraded. So industrialization is an upgrading process. It's not a construction of new ideas. It's an upgrading of what you are already producing into mass forms of then producing primary products, whether it's agricultural or whatever, and then mass manufacturing it and mass consuming our own goods, not imports. That's the mentality that has to change in universities first, if we're going to tackle this industrialization aspect properly. Otherwise, we think just building a factory here, building one day is industrializing society. No. Industrialization of rural areas can only be driven by the entire economy. It cannot be an agenda for 1 or 2 ministries. It has to be the whole cabinet. Every ministry in a country has to have an agenda and a budget focused on industrialization of the rural countryside into small towns and big towns. If it happens that this silo approach to government, where a few ministries focus on rural areas and the rest is just going all over the place where it doesn't make a difference, we will never transform the economies, because it's only when the majority of rural people start earning an average of $4 plus a day, that they themselves will have sufficient income. They will start now being able to change their consumption patterns. They'll be consuming more locally manufactured goods. They'll be consuming more meats, vegetables, fruits. Now you're beginning to build a serious domestic market for a middle income country. So let's focus on diversifying rather than just rebuilding existing factories. A major diversification, like we have seen the Asian tigers do. We have to create backwards and forwards linkages between all the key sectors so that we're not just stuck with, oh, we can't produce enough of our own soybean, therefore let's import. We can't produce enough of this. Let's say, if we're going to push production of soybean, what is the total number of products we are importing already that are made from soybean? Because you may just say we're producing soybean for cooking oil and some of it goes in animal feed, but then there's another 10 products which are not agricultural food, but industrial, different types of oils that go into different parts of engineering and manufacturing. So we need line of sight of all possibilities that can come from our raw materials. That's what I mean by universities focusing on backward and forward linkages between rural and urban economies, because the manufacturing sector is a total approach. We have to produce new goods and services that are obviously absent simply because we don't understand the stages in industrial growth. That's why we end up importing tea, things like teas, biscuits, toothpicks, cooking oil. I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the moment we stop running and thinking, you will then understand that our dependence on foreign currency, the reason why we are drunk and we're addicted to foreign currency is because we produce what we don't depend on, and we depend on what we don't produce. And therefore we need foreign currency to continue to produce things which could easily be produced locally, or alternatives that make more sense. But we don't focus on that. And as universities, we have to say no and work on a reconfiguration of our consumption patterns. So I've been saying it before, now I'm going to say it more loudly. Doesn't matter what your definition of industrialization is. I say it's a massification mindset. It's an idea of taking an area. So in an African country, subtract all the major cities like Johannesburg, Harare, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, whatever. Take them out of the equation for a minute and then say, let's go rural. And then we include the rural towns. Now we can start redefining industrialization as a massification. So give yourself a 50-kilometer range. So if you're a university in the countryside, give yourself a 50, maximum 100-kilometer range, and say within that 50 to maximum 100-kilometer range, we must mass produce our raw materials, and within the same distance of 50 kilometers, mass process them, and at least the majority of them, and then mass consume them ourselves within that 50-kilometer range. The moment within a 50-kilometer range, you're able to mass produce raw materials, mass process them, or most of them, and then mass consume them, or most of them, then you're on to industrializing society, because eventually you'll have excess, and eventually you will be exporting. You don't start by exporting. You will never develop just by starting by exporting. So today, when we see ourselves consuming noodles from China, we think that it's a result of industrialization in China. No, noodles were produced well before China was an industrial giant, because they're producing the noodles in the village and the township, not in the big city. Like many other products, they have to be produced locally and consumed locally. It's only now they are able to export to us who don't produce enough of our own goods. The final thing I would like to put on the table for universities, therefore, is to understand these 3 stages of industrialization of society. And I already spoke about proto-industrialization. I know in Africa, we call it informal sector and all these kind of weird words. In Zimbabwe, my own country, we have CSO in Harare, which is a mass manufacturing entity by the so-called informal people. No factories, but they manufacture almost anything. Furniture, they will repair cars, they will manufacture building material, you know, from door frames. They'll manufacture most things needed in society without factories. But they continue to be considered as informal. If you go and if we learn something from the Asian tigers, they realize it's a mistake to call them informal. It's proto-industrialization. The entire government policy should focus on that group and say, how do we upgrade them from proto-industries, expand their activities so that they can meet more demand. It's only when the proto-industries grow in the villages, in the townships, and small towns, that we see small towns becoming vibrant. Small towns now manufacture light things. They're able to increase their own incomes of their citizens. You begin to see the small towns becoming economically viable because their ratepayers can now pay meaningful rates and the city councils can now repair roads and these potholes and so on. That's why we have to start with stage 1 proto-industries. It's only when incomes start rising in the rural areas, small towns and so on, that we see the expansion of other goods and services coming in, being manufactured locally. That's what we now call light industries. They usually require small machines, you know, to produce all manner of things, from textile things to leatherware to medicines, and you know, you start being able to manufacture your own toothpicks, nails, name it. Now, light industries is the proliferation of these small machines, and that's really the beauty of an industrial upgrading process. But it's only then when you have a proliferation of small machines of different types that the demand for heavy industry comes in. Because heavy industry does not mean anything. It's not just building a steel mill. Heavy industry means you now have so much demand for the key services. Starting, take steel. Now, if you have a 200,000, a million small machines across your country, which it manufacturing all manner of small things from foods, snacks to textile and leather, then it means that the demand for steel goes up. That's what increases the demand for steel, and how the steel mills can be viable. Instead of just being propped up by the state, they can actually be viable. And then the foundries start growing around the small towns, because now if you got thousands upon thousands of machines which you start by importing, you realize that it's not worth anymore importing all these spare parts for these machines. They have to be prefabricated locally. So the foundries will be prefabricating bearing for these, what for that. Water, demand for power, that's how big industry, heavy industry comes in. So universities have to understand the relationship between proto-industry, light industries, and heavy industries. Otherwise, once again, we keep wondering why we are failing all the time even to prop up one steel mill in a country, because we are not upgrading the proto and light industry to have seriously effective demand for the heavy industry. So the long and the short is also because we have been sold this dummy by Western countries that a market is just a God-given thing, just respect the wishes of the market, it's like a God. No, the market is a public good. The market can be developed, like we have seen now with the Asian tigers. You develop the market, and we have to develop markets for locally manufactured goods. We have to create the markets through meaningful public policies and public expenditure. You will find with the next slide. So the universities also in Africa need to also understand all these countries who have kind of advanced ahead of us, from the early ones in Europe to the latest ones in Asia. How did they build this competitiveness? These are the things we need to be teaching in our universities to upgrade people's mindsets from early stages in the university. By the time they are in the industry, they don't even have to be employed, even if they go out and as they should to build their own businesses and production systems. We have to, on the right-hand side, I've shown the 3 stages in which the economies are growing. You start off as factor-driven economies, which is where almost every African country is, even the industrial ones that have kind of grown, like South Africa and so on. We are still, it's still factor-driven because we are still largely exporting raw materials, gold, this, that, and the other. And most of our products go out in semi-processed form. But we need to move to efficiency-driven economies and then ultimately innovation-driven economies. And on the left, I've indicated from the literature what the basic requirements are for each stage, because things don't just happen by accident or trial and error. We have to create at the current stage where every African country is. It's all about key institutions which understand the relationship between rural and urban, key infrastructure which links rural and urban, a macroeconomic stability, which means we understand how the fiscal and monetary policies can be translated into broad-based development at provincial, local level, and human capital development, meaningful education which links people to their own circumstances. Then that's how you lift people quickly out of poverty, like China did within 10 years. By the second decade, they were already into the efficiency stage, where higher education and training is now family connected to realities of the nation and to the production of goods and services that are relevant to an average person. So you now begin to see goods and market efficiency, labor efficiency. The banks start going very vibrant because now you have banks that are built on local balance sheet and local capital and not foreign. So it means that they can do serious business locally and eventually leverage business overseas. That's why today China is the 3 largest banks in the world. You know, it was not built through borrowing from the IMF, blah, blah. It's built through local efficiency enhancers. And then finally, of course, the innovation stage, where I've already been talking a lot about innovation to you today. Next, please. So I won't spend much more time on this because the relationship between universities and the state are very important. That you just don't have developmental state capabilities in government with a dominant university system. The university system is an integral part of it because there are these 5 major elements of a developmental state. These capabilities need to be built with the support of universities, starting with managerialism, which is at the top of the list, managing things efficiently, precisely, planning and achieving goals, getting things done, technical and bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, because if our civil servants are not technically savvy, if they're not just as savvy as the people in business, how can you then be the ones leading the business people? It means you cannot make policy. The private sector will make policy for you. Okay. Institutional rationalization, because let's not be stuck with the same structure of organizations as they were constructed for us by the colonials. We need to keep reinventing the institutional arrangements so that we really have deep thinking of how to redesign them and restructure them so that we keep pulling out the efficiencies and the intellectual prowess of our otherwise highly intelligent Africans whom we see in these organizations, but they cannot change them because there's no appetite for institutional rationalization. And I've already spoken about human capital development and the enabling environment. So universities have to produce both thinkers and doers. The idea that university will just produce thinkers and the doers are going to be produced by technical college and somewhere else has to be history. This is my final slide. We will produce thinkers And here's the category of thinkers that universities have to produce. We have to eventually have dreamers. The dreamers are key. Today, people actually look down upon dreamers. They say, it's the dreamer. All advanced nations, all things that are high level that have been achieved in the world starts with serious dreamers. But these are not idle dreamers. Universities produce serious dreamers, not idle dreamers. So people who can see future society which is advanced, future ideas which are not yet tested. Okay, I can drop them down quickly, no problem. Then philosophers, because if we don't produce our own philosophers and we still rely on Socrates and these other European philosophers, we are shortchanging ourselves. Universities have to produce serious African philosophers. Artists, because artists break down boundaries. They can communicate beyond our usual kind of technical and constipated ways of just communicating in limited ways. Okay, I just throw them all down, please. So that to me is those three are your more serious kind of thinkers without doing as much, although they're doing more and more. Like artists can really hard workers, and they can produce a lot. Then you got your visionaries, because a visionary is a thinker-doer. There's no visionary. A visionary, I'm putting this in thinker-doer because visionary are people who see advanced, but they see an advanced future in a very realistic way, and they're able to actually show people how to get there. You see, then you got explorers, people who are exploring new ideas. They're doing more. They are still thinkers, but they are doing most of their thinking through doing, and that's where we usually come up with our innovators, people who focus on specific sectors, specific issues, and come up with fantastic innovations. Then we have our mass producers, people who just know how to make things and produce them. Those producers and makers is then what we see in most production, highly productive societies. But you can see that the relationship between thinker and doer, it has to be created at all levels. And universities have to recreate this and not just assume that we're going to produce a few explorers and visionaries, and then the producers and makers for some other system to produce. It's not going to happen. It's a disconnection which is not taking us very far. I think that's really all I wanted to cover today, and I'll be quite happy to have a conversation on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Please use the hand reaction emoji if you've got a question or contribution, and we'll unmute you if you've got a question or contribution. Thank you. Jonathan?
Thank you, Prof, for a very wonderful presentation, very inspiring. My question is on the fact that you highlighted that the university and other parts of society co-evolve. In other words, these things change together at the same time. My question is, as they change together at the same time, are we aware of the roles that each of these players play? So is there a clear understanding of the division of labor and also division of knowledge among these systems so that we can transform our societies? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Jonathan. Dr. Mtetwa?
I needed to unmute myself. Prof, I want to thank you so much for such a very inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. My background is in archaeology. I was very happy to see you address even this issue all the way from human origins. So an immediate question that came to my mind when you were discussing when you sliced industrialization into about 5 levels, especially when you were saying this has to be inculcated in our first year students in the university. And the immediate question that came into mind was that, could there be a possibility of this way of, because what I hear from you is catching them young. Is there a possibility of this 5.0 cascading all the way to our primary? Because for me, what you're talking about is very important, and it looks like a bottom up. Why starting at a first year? Why not having this socialized into our students from grade 1, or if possible, kindergarten? Last week you gave an example of a 2-year, 3-year kid or kids who were helping each other, navigate a landscape of plants that are poisonous and some that are okay, which is the African model. Is what you are talking about possible to socialize our people from as early as when they discover their environments? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. Jonathan?
Thank you. I've lowered my hand.
Okay. We've got Alois, then we hand over to Prof to respond.
Hello, thank you very much, Prof, for this discussion. You really have carried it on from last week in a brilliant way. Thanks a lot. I just want to follow on to what the 2 earlier questions from Ezekiel and the other guy were. My question is, I remember when I was recruited to teach at the university, I do not remember ever being involved in some education or enlightenment on how my role as a lecturer impacts on the overall national development. And I would just like to see, following on from your discussion, how we may need to have some kind of program for the university teaching staff to have this philosophy on board, so that they can infuse it into their teaching and then pass it on to the students. And it would be so much more helpful. They would design their lectures and teaching a little bit more, I may be using the term wrongly, innovatively. But yeah, I think you see what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, moderator. I mean, these are really just brilliant contributions, part questions, but I'm also learning quite a bit from these contributions, starting with Dr. Jonathan, because this, and you use the term co-evolve, which is really a nice term, which I'm going to borrow from you and use from now on, because that is the whole essence of transformation. I probably fit some of these comments together because the co-evolution is also the co-creation process. And the co-creation process answers some of the points raised by Dr. Mtetwa and Dr. Alois Rungwe. If I jump to Dr. Alois's point, and he says he doesn't remember as a new lecturer at the university being inducted or oriented in any way towards, well, this is really our role in society and how we're trying to play this role. Well, the thing about the African university and the African educational system as a whole is the failure to realize that everything we call knowledge today, technical textbook knowledge, started somewhere as informal knowledge. And I always use the example of the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom is where agricultural revolution and industrial revolution were connected. I mean, we had seen agricultural revolution in Africa before it went to Europe, but it never translocated into industrial revolution. So the UK were the first. But you see, the United Kingdom rather, up until today, is a country which is supposed to be democratic, push democracy in the world, but they themselves, they don't have a constitution. They talk about constitutionalism. They have never written their constitution. It's not written. So I understand, or maybe bits and pieces is written, but it's because it evolved. It co-evolved, to use Jonathan Stem. And then it doesn't have to be written. Anything in any society which co-evolves, it becomes nature, becomes DNA. And then when we copy it, we say university lectures are not inducted because we copied it from Oxford and Cambridge and Liverpool universities who don't, because in their society, you don't have to. The system is automatic. They know it. It's part and parcel of the DNA of how you're connected to broader society and the industrial process. But when we translocate that system to Africa, now we have lecturers going to university. They're not, same with me. If it's gonna make you feel better, Dr. Ungwe, I was exactly like you. No one told me anything about even how to lecture, how to be a good one or a bad one. But you know, the point is that we have to acknowledge that our university systems are still an implant from a society which had evolved its own systems and co-created it and co-evolved it without having to write most of the things down. All they were writing is actual knowledge, the content, the process of how it happened. They never wrote it down. Now we copied it and we have not translated it into our own systems and procedures. So Dr. Mtetwa's point, I appreciate the hearing this from an archaeologist, because honestly, you know, I've been struggling in our case here in Zimbabwe. I'm thinking, my goodness, okay, we lost a lot of knowledge, some of it archaeological, when the so-called learned ones came as colonial masters and dug up everything and stole a lot of the knowledge. But if we focus on the industrialization issue that we're talking about, you called it kind of a bottom-up approach. How can we inculcate this from our children from the word go, from grade one, not just wait until first year university? You know, I like that. Here is why it is important to go that route in an industrializing nation. I have been looking at youngsters now as a grandfather, and I look at grandchildren. I look at all the people who are my grandchildren's age, and I notice that we are bringing them up wrongly again, because if we look at how societies who industrialized themselves and did not wait to import the process, their children, they have key tasks and roles that they play, and they have set for them at different stages of development. And it's a science. I've been digging into, as you know now, I dig into areas which I wasn't trained at university at, because I concluded a long time ago, the areas I was trained in, it's not even the absolute truth. I still have to discover truth. So I decided everything that I'm able to read or find out, I'm gonna dig. And I found that in the early child care education, in industrialized countries, they figured all this out. It's a deep science. Between the age of 2 and 3, what are the kind of chores you give to your children? Even so basic. And by the time they're 3 or 4, they should be able to make the bed. They should be able to do this. They should be able to do that. They should be able to do that. So before they even go into a formal school, you have a whole curriculum of basic chores and activities that children should be able to do, linking that to the whole process of society, doing things for ourselves, industrializing and making sure that you are part of a society which does things for ourselves. We produce our own things, we manufacture them ourselves, we consume them ourselves, and they better our lives. So I would, I don't know whether that kind of answers Dr. Mtetwa, but I honestly think now we need to train parents how to bring our children so that from the ages of 3, 4, 5, they are able to complete certain specific skills, tasks, and so on, which prepares them for the real world and real society, and not stop. By the time they go to primary school and secondary school, we continue relating their school education to the home education and community education. But by the time they get to university, definitely with Dr. Alwis and Dr. Jonathan, we now need the whole educational system at a high level to say it's a mentality, it's a mindset, it's a state of mind of here is who we are increasing in numbers, population, our systems of production, manufacturing, consumption transform us. More and more people are going into urban areas, but as though into urban areas, what really changes? We research how do we keep, what are the good things from our traditional society that are worth keeping, that are wholesome? What are the ones that really have to go? We have to accept paradigm shifts as society transforms, but doing it ourselves, to ourselves, not being told by others. So thank you so much for these contributions. I really found them useful. Thank you.
Due to time, we'll do one more round of questions and contributions, and then we'll hand over to Prof to close off the session. So please use the hand reaction emoji if you've got a question or contribution before we close off the session. Any questions or contributions? Dr. Ungwe?
Sorry to be, it's a reflection of the excitement I have over this subject, but I just want to pick up again on the issue of curriculum, because I think that's the foundation of all teaching, and I just want Prof to try and dissect how, maybe using the example of one country, how we can have a university curriculum that incorporates these development values, or even a high school curriculum. How can we infuse this into our curriculum? Do we give a specific subjects? You know, the Americans have their high school and primary subjects in governance and development, or yeah, what are your ideas? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ungwe. Any more questions or contributions? So over to you, Prof. You can respond to that and then close off the session.
Respond and then sum up. Yeah, you know, Dr. Ungwe, I have no answer to your question. I just have a couple of examples that are vivid in my mind. It's a researchable question you have posed here that I'm going to keep digging into. But the two interesting models that I've come across is the American model and the Japanese model. So how did the Americans do it? I think the Americans ultimately said, look, a university, you are aware of the kind of land grant university approach that the US used from 1855 going forward. It was basically a way of saying this university is not a high heaven where people can't reach. It's going to be built in the state, for the state, and the way it's going to be run by the communities. It has to dwell on issues that are relevant to the local society. So they would do everything. They would teach. When you look at the curriculum they used on home economics, this was for me the most fascinating thing when I dug into, so what were they teaching at the beginning? They would teach things like home economics. We call it today, when you look at home economics, it's almost like an industry, you know, baking and sewing. But when they were teaching home economics in those state grant universities, they would go into the homes of people on a daily basis. And the people would come into the university department of home economics on a daily basis and address basic things. Okay, we're having challenges in preserving the meat. There were no fridges at the time, I suppose. How do you preserve meat during this time of the year, that time of the year? What are the techniques? What cleaning? You know, we're cleaning the homes, making it more healthy. But they would cover things affecting people on a day-to-day basis. What do they have for breakfast? And after that, what for lunch and what for dinner? They understood the production and consumption patterns of people. And that would then be fed into the overall aspects of what makes sense for commerce and industry. The industrial processes are linked to this, because so somebody does not then need to be afraid of universities, or it's only universities for my kid to go and be trained for a job. The university was society. It was a reflection of society, and all the way up to sports. And so it was, I remember myself now as a youngster in secondary school would say, what's wrong with American universities? They teach sports, it's such a big deal. But it was a driver. It connected the college to society at a deep level. So that's one model I would put on the table. The Japanese model was fascinating for me because the Japanese were more kind of hungry to catch up with the West. They're really moving fast. They were a highly confident society. And they eventually then were left behind. They lost in the Second World War. When coming back, the Japanese model is like this, the way I understood it. So let's use and I've used the example of the bullet train before, because that's one that I got straight from a Japanese professor. So no, we really have to build, we want to build the fastest passenger train in the world. So what do? The Japanese say then, put everything down. We are going to create a department in a university or an institution or a completely new university whose role is to study everything in the world that is known about trains. So for the next 2-3 years, everything that's known about trains, they will study and put on and they will know it. And then they will say, right, now we know everything that everyone else knows. What we advance beyond here, we are ahead of the pack. So eventually they will build the first bullet train. And you can say that about many other areas that they broke into, from electronics to what have you, just by turning around the idea of the developmental university and saying, so let's use the example of Zimbabwe now. We want to be not just the best and most efficient producers of gold in the world, but we will also process gold and jewelry and everything better than any society in the world. Now, the next day, we work on it, cabinet approves and votes resources to say, we are going to build an institution, or let's make it part of University of Zimbabwe, or no, it has to be a completely new institution attached to so and so or independently. We learn everything in the world that is known about producing gold, processing it, jewelry from gold, and the markets and the whole, so that in no time at all, 2 to 3 years, we know everything that everybody knows in the world, and we can make it just as good as anyone else makes it in the world. And then from there, we know we are at the head of the game. We are integrated. And so our entire sector that is involved in that thing is deeply immersed in it, with the idea that we're going to be the best in the world. So these are just examples from other nations I've given you. But I suppose your real question has not been fully answered, except to say that we can come up with our own ways in our own countries of saying, if we look at the 4 most important aspects of our societies, our culture, social organization from family to community and all that, deep research needed there. Because really our families were the strongest in the world ever for a long time. We did not need, orphans were looked, there was no destitute children and women and street kids. It was automatically, we had strong family and community structures. Now they are slowly becoming amongst the weakest. We need deep research to reconstruct in contemporary times, the African family and community. What is the research? I would say it's an example of how we would, a whole government would say, we are going to master and understand how our families are disintegrating and how our community structures at the village level are no longer delivering a strong self-governing society. We're going to research into it and understand all the elements and start reconstructing it, passing the right policies and the right budgetary support for these activities. And you can go to other sectors of society with the same kind of mentality, and we will have our university right in front of these, working with universities, with the governments. So I'm not going to say much, because I spoke a lot today, because I'm not only passionate about the topic, but I was just trying hard. I'm trying very hard to figure out how we tip the whole thing on its head. I said before, and avoiding to contradict myself, I've said at the beginning, early child care education is the most important, even more important than university education, because what a kid learns between the age of 1 and 7 lives with them for the rest of their lives, determines 95% of their personality and their ability to innovate and think outside the box, and many, many other things. But I'm now saying the university is better poised to change the entire system of education and the way our society thinks of itself and how to transform ourselves. If the university does not drive it, it's very difficult, because people are stuck in the textbooks and the educational system, which is still got the wrong content. If the universities don't change this content and process and take the whole society with us in the university process, it's going to be tough to figure out where the impetus for transformation is going to come from. Because at the end of the day, knowledge only exists at the point of action. It's what people actually do, using what knowledge. That's important, and education comes in because it then co-creates by bringing in new concepts, new ideas. That's the opportunity we have as university to stimulate the transformational process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that presentation. This brings the end to our session. Would like to invite everybody to like our Facebook page or follow us on YouTube, Dialogue with Prof Mandi Rukuni. Please subscribe to get future content. Thank you once again for joining us, and big shout out to the DWP technical team for putting the session together. Thank you and good night. See you next week as we continue this topic.